Hello dear listener and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to know how your day has been. Whether it was filled with joy or challenges, you're exactly where you need to be right now. What time is it where you are in the world? Are you settling down for the evening, or perhaps finding a quiet moment in the middle of your day? Wherever you are listening from, know that you are part of our global community of souls, seeking peace and spiritual connection. If this is your first time joining us, please consider subscribing to Sacred Slumber. We're here to bring you stories that nourish the spirit and calm the mind. Tonight, we journey to ancient Judah, to a time when God called a young man named Jeremiah to carry a message of both warning and hope. This is a story about divine calling, about being reshaped by loving hands, and about finding purpose even in the midst of struggle. So settle in, take a deep breath, and let us begin. In the 13th year of King Josiah's reign over the kingdom of Judah, when the morning mist still clung to the hills of Anathoth, a young man named Jeremiah sat beneath the shade of an ancient olive tree. The leaves whispered secrets in the gentle breeze, and somewhere in that whisper something stirred within his heart. Something he couldn't yet name, but could feel as surely as the warm earth beneath his feet. Jeremiah was not like the other young men of his village. While they spoke boldly of their plans and dreams, he preferred the quiet company of his thoughts. While they gathered in the marketplace to debate and jest, he found himself drawn to solitary places where he could listen to the deeper rhythms of life. His father, Hilkiah, was a priest, and perhaps that was why Jeremiah felt such a natural pull toward the sacred, toward the spaces where heaven seemed to touch earth. On this particular morning, as the sun climbed higher and cast dancing shadows through the olive branches, Jeremiah felt that familiar stirring grow stronger. It was as if someone were calling his name from a great distance, though he heard no voice with his ears. The sensation was both thrilling and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a vast ocean, knowing you were meant to step in but uncertain of your ability to swim. Then, as clearly as if someone had spoken directly into his ear, came the words that would change everything. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Jeremiah's heart raced. He looked around, half expecting to see someone standing nearby, but he was alone with only the olive tree and the endless blue sky as witnesses. The voice came again, gentle yet unmistakable. Jeremiah, I have called you to be my messenger. The young man's immediate response was one of panic. Sovereign Lord, he whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. I don't know how to speak. I am too young. Who would listen to me? I am nobody special, just a priest's son from a small village. Surely you have made a mistake. But the presence that surrounded him was filled with such love and certainty that his fears began to quiet. Do not say you are too young, came the gentle correction. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you. In that moment, Jeremiah felt something touch his lips. Not a physical touch, but something deeper, more real than anything he had ever experienced. I have put my words in your mouth, the voice continued. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. As the presence gradually faded, leaving only the normal sounds of morning, birds singing, leaves rustling, the distant lowing of cattle, Jeremiah remained sitting beneath the olive tree, stunned by what had just occurred. His life had been ordinary just moments before, and now he was being called to something extraordinary. The weight of it should have crushed him, but instead he felt a strange peace settling over his spirit. He didn't yet understand what lay ahead, couldn't foresee the years of rejection and persecution that awaited him, or the deep wells of sorrow he would have to draw from. He only knew that the God of his fathers had spoken to him, had chosen him for a purpose that was both terrible and wonderful. And though he trembled at the thought of it, something deep within him whispered back, Yes, Lord, I will go. Months passed after Jeremiah's calling, and he found himself struggling with the enormity of his task. The messages that came to him were not easy ones. Words of warning about the spiritual condition of Judah, prophecies of coming judgment if the people didn't turn back to their God. How could he, a young man with no credentials or authority, stand before the elders and priests and kings with such heavy words? One morning, as Jeremiah prayed in the quiet of his chamber, seeking guidance for this impossible mission, he heard the familiar voice of the Lord speaking to him once again. "Go down to the potter's house, and there I will give you my message." Jeremiah had passed by the potter's house countless times in his life, but had never paid it much attention. It was a humble building on the outskirts of the village, marked by the constant sound of the spinning wheel and the earthy smell of wet clay. As he approached that day, however, he felt a sense of anticipation, as if he were about to witness something profound. The potter was an elderly man named Malachi, whose hands bore the calluses and clay stains of decades spent at his craft. His hair was white as wool, and his eyes held the patient wisdom of someone who had spent his life creating beauty from formless earth. When Jeremiah arrived, Malachi looked up from his wheel and smiled, as if he'd been expecting him. "Shalom, young prophet," Malachi said, his voice warm with genuine kindness. "Please sit and watch. I have work to do." Jeremiah settled himself on a wooden stool in the corner of the workshop, fascinated despite himself. He had never really watched a potter at work before, had never paid attention to the intricate process of creation that happened in this simple space. The wheel began to turn, and Malachi placed a lump of clay in the centre, his hands moving with practiced precision. At first the clay seemed to resist, wobbling and threatening to collapse, but Malachi's hands were steady and sure, applying just the right amount of pressure, guiding the clay upward into the beginning of what would become a vessel. Jeremiah watched in wonder as the formless lump slowly took shape, a wide base, curving sides, the promise of something beautiful and functional. But then something went wrong. Perhaps there was a stone in the clay, or a dry patch that wouldn't bend. The emerging vessel began to collapse, its sides caving in despite the potter's careful ministrations. Jeremiah expected to see frustration on Malachi's face, perhaps anger at the ruined work. Instead, the old man simply smiled and pressed the clay back into a lump, ready to begin again. "The clay has its own nature," Malachi explained, his hands already starting to reshape the material. "Sometimes it has hard spots, or air bubbles, or impurities that make it difficult to work with. But clay is forgiving. It can always be reformed, reshaped, made into something new." As Jeremiah watched, the potter began again, this time working the clay more thoroughly, removing the impurities that had caused the first attempt to fail. Slowly, patiently, lovingly, a new vessel began to emerge, different from the first but no less beautiful. In fact, this second creation seemed to have a character all its own, shaped by the very challenges that had destroyed its predecessor. It was then that Jeremiah heard the voice of the Lord speaking to him, as clear as if someone were standing beside him. "Can I not do with you, Israel, as this potter does? Like clay in the hand of the potter, so are you in my hand." The words hit Jeremiah like a revelation. He understood now why he had been sent to this place, why he needed to witness this simple yet profound act of creation. The people of Judah were like clay in God's hands, sometimes stubborn, sometimes marred by the impurities of sin and rebellion. But God was not a harsh taskmaster who would discard them when they failed to take shape properly. He was like Malachi, patient and loving, willing to reshape them again and again until they became the vessels he had always intended them to be. "The message I want you to carry," the Lord continued, "is not just one of judgment, but of hope. Yes, I must sometimes tear down what is corrupt and broken, but I tear down in order to build up again, in order to create something better and more beautiful than before." Jeremiah felt tears welling up in his eyes as he watched the potter's hands continue their gentle work. Here was a picture of God's character that he had never fully grasped before. Not the angry judge he had sometimes imagined, but the patient artist who sees potential in every lump of clay, who never gives up on his creation, who can bring beauty from the most unlikely materials. "Thank you," he whispered to Malachi as he prepared to leave. The old potter looked up from his work and smiled. "The clay thanks the potter by yielding to his hands," Malachi replied. "Perhaps that is all any of us can do, yield to the hands that know how to shape us into something beautiful." As Jeremiah walked home through the narrow streets of his village, he felt a new understanding of his calling beginning to take root in his heart. He was not just a bearer of bad news, but a messenger of hope. The God who had called him was not a destroyer but a creator, not a tyrant but a loving craftsman who would never abandon his work. The words came to him then, the message he would carry to the people of Judah. "If at any time I announce that a nation or kingdom is to be uprooted, torn down and destroyed, and if that nation I warned repents of its evil, then I will relent and not inflict on it the disaster I had planned. And if at another time I announce that a nation or kingdom is to be built up and planted, and if it does evil in my sight and does not obey me, then I will reconsider the good I had intended to do for it." It was a message of both warning and promise, of judgment and mercy intertwined. Like the potter's hands, God's discipline was always aimed at restoration, always working toward the creation of something more beautiful than before. Armed with this new understanding, Jeremiah began his prophetic ministry in earnest. But if he had hoped that his message of God's love and patience would be readily received, he was quickly disillusioned. The people of Judah, from the poorest peasant to the most powerful priest, seemed determined to resist the very hands that were trying to reshape them. His first major public appearance came during the reign of King Jehoiakim, Josiah's son, who had turned away from his father's reforms and allowed idolatry to flourish once again throughout the land. Jeremiah stood in the temple courts, his voice carrying across the stone courtyard as he delivered the message God had given him. "This is what the Lord says," he proclaimed, his young voice growing stronger with each word. "Reform your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this place. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, 'This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord.' If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the foreigner, the fatherless or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place in the land I gave your ancestors for ever and ever." The reaction was immediate and hostile. The priests, who had grown comfortable with their compromises and political alliances, saw Jeremiah's words as a direct threat to their authority. The wealthy merchants and nobles who had prospered by exploiting the poor and forming partnerships with pagan nations heard his call for justice as an attack on their way of life. "Who does this young man think he is?" they muttered among themselves. "He speaks of judgment and destruction like some kind of doomsday prophet. Where is his authority? Where are his credentials?" But Jeremiah continued, his heart breaking even as he spoke the words God had given him. He could see the spiritual adultery that had infected his beloved nation, the way they had turned from the God who had delivered them from Egypt and given them this promised land. They had made alliances with foreign powers, adopted their gods, and forgotten the covenant that had made them a people set apart. "My people have committed 2 sins," he declared, his voice now thick with emotion. "They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water." The imagery was powerful and heartbreaking. Jeremiah could see it so clearly. A nation that had access to the purest, most life-giving water imaginable, yet had chosen instead to dig broken wells that left them thirsty and desperate. They had exchanged their glory for worthless idols, their security for political alliances that would ultimately fail them. As the weeks and months passed, Jeremiah's message remained consistent, but the opposition grew fiercer. He was mocked in the streets, his words dismissed as the ravings of a madman. Children threw stones at him, and adults crossed to the other side of the road to avoid his presence. The loneliness was crushing, but what hurt most was seeing the people he loved rushing toward destruction, their ears closed to the voice of the one who wanted to save them. One particularly dark day, after being physically threatened by a group of priests who wanted to silence him permanently, Jeremiah found himself wondering if he had misunderstood his calling. Perhaps God hadn't really spoken to him at all. Perhaps he was just a deluded young man with an overactive imagination and a tendency toward melancholy. But then he remembered the potter's house, the gentle hands shaping and reshaping the clay, and he understood something profound about the nature of love. True love doesn't just tell people what they want to hear, it tells them what they need to hear, even when that truth is painful. The potter sometimes had to apply pressure to the clay, had to work out the impurities and air bubbles, and this process wasn't always comfortable for the clay, but it was necessary for the clay to become what it was meant to be. "I am not their enemy," Jeremiah whispered to himself as he walked through the quiet streets late one evening. "I am their friend. I am speaking these hard words because I love them, because God loves them, because we can't bear to see them destroy themselves." The revelation gave him strength to continue, even as the opposition intensified. He began to write down his prophecies, creating a record of God's words that could be preserved even if his voice was silenced. He wrote of the coming judgment, but also of the hope that lay beyond it, the promise of a new covenant, a time when God would write his law on their hearts rather than on tablets of stone. "The days are coming," he wrote, his hand moving quickly across the parchment, "when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people." Even in the midst of his loneliness and rejection, Jeremiah held on to this vision of hope. The potter was still at work, still shaping, still creating something beautiful from the clay of human hearts. The process might be painful, but the end result would be worth it all. There came a time when the weight of his calling became almost too much for Jeremiah to bear. The constant rejection, the threats, the loneliness of being God's messenger to a people who didn't want to hear from God. It all pressed down on him like a physical burden. He had been faithful to his calling for years now, and what did he have to show for it? A nation that seemed more rebellious than ever, leaders who actively opposed him, and a heart that felt like it might break from the strain. The breaking point came when Pasha, the priest who was chief officer in the temple, had Jeremiah beaten and put in stocks overnight for prophesying that Jerusalem would be destroyed. The humiliation was complete, displayed like a common criminal in front of the very people he was trying to save. When he was released the next morning, bruised and aching, Jeremiah's first instinct was to flee. He made his way to his favourite spot of solitude, a small grove of trees outside the city where he often went to pray. There, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of nature, he poured out his heart to God in words that were both complaint and lament. "You deceived me, Lord, and I was deceived," he cried out, his voice raw with emotion. "You overpowered me and prevailed. I am ridiculed all day long. Everyone mocks me. Whenever I speak, I cry out proclaiming violence and destruction. So the word of the Lord has brought me insult and reproach all day long." The words felt almost blasphemous as they left his lips, but they were honest words, torn from the depths of his soul. He'd given everything to this calling. His youth, his dreams of a normal life, his relationships with family and friends. And for what? To be treated as a pariah, a madman, a troublemaker. In that moment of deepest despair, Jeremiah made a decision that felt like the only sane choice left to him. He would be silent. No more prophecies, no more warnings, no more attempts to turn the hearts of a stubborn people back to their God. He would find a quiet corner of the world and live out his days in peace, letting others worry about the spiritual condition of the nation. The resolve felt good at first, like setting down a burden that had been crushing him. For several days, he said nothing about the visions that continued to come to him, ignored the urgings in his spirit to speak out against the injustices he witnessed. He tried to live like a normal person, to find satisfaction in simple pleasures and everyday concerns. But something strange began to happen. The more he tried to suppress the words God had given him, the more they seemed to burn within him. It was as if a fire had been kindled in his bones, a flame that grew hotter the more he tried to smother it. The visions wouldn't stop coming. The burden for his people wouldn't lift, and the words of God seemed to be blazing inside him like a furnace. But if I say, I will not mention his word or speak any more in his name, he found himself whispering, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot. The realization came to him gradually, like dawn breaking over the mountains. He couldn't stop being a prophet any more than he could stop being human. This wasn't just something he did. It was who he was. God had formed him in the womb for this purpose, had written this calling into the very fabric of his being. To deny it would be to deny himself, to attempt to live as someone he was never meant to be. But more than that, he began to understand that his struggles and sufferings were not signs that he had failed in his calling, but evidence that he was fulfilling it exactly as God intended. The potter sometimes had to apply intense heat to the clay to make it strong and durable. The fire in his bones wasn't a punishment. It was the very thing that qualified him to speak for God. "The Lord is with me like a mighty warrior," he declared, his voice growing stronger with each word. "So my persecutors will stumble and not prevail. They will fail and be thoroughly disgraced. Their dishonour will never be forgotten." The change in perspective was revolutionary. Instead of seeing his sufferings as evidence of God's abandonment, Jeremiah began to understand them as proof of God's presence. The fire in his bones wasn't consuming him. It was refining him, purifying him, making him into the kind of vessel that could carry God's words to a broken world. He thought again of the potter's house, of the way Malachi had worked the clay with such patience and skill. Sometimes the potter had to put the vessel into the fire to make it strong, to burn away the impurities and set the shape permanently. The heat wasn't cruelty, it was love, the kind of love that was willing to do whatever it took to create something beautiful and lasting. "I will speak," Jeremiah said aloud, his voice carrying across the quiet grove. "I will speak because I must, because the words are like fire in my bones, because God has made me a prophet to the nations. I will speak not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. I will speak not because people want to hear, but because they need to hear. I will speak because the potter is still at work and I am his instrument." The fire in his bones had become not a burden, but a gift, not a curse, but a blessing. It was the very thing that enabled him to continue when everything else told him to quit, the divine energy that sustained him through rejection and persecution. He was not just a messenger, he was a burning message, a living embodiment of God's passionate love for his people. The years passed, and Jeremiah's prophecies began to unfold with heartbreaking accuracy. The Babylonian army, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, laid siege to Jerusalem just as God had warned through his prophet. The city that had been called the joy of the whole earth was now surrounded by enemy forces, its people trapped within walls that had once seemed impregnable. During the siege, Jeremiah found himself in an impossible position. His prophecies of judgment were being fulfilled before everyone's eyes, but instead of vindicating him, this only increased the hostility toward him. The leaders of Jerusalem accused him of being a traitor, of collaborating with the enemy by undermining morale with his gloomy predictions. "You're deserting to the Babylonians," they shouted when he tried to leave the city on a simple errand. They arrested him, beat him, and threw him into a dungeon where he remained for many days, forgotten and alone. But even in that dark place, the word of the Lord continued to come to him, and strangely it was not a word of judgment, but of hope. "Call to me and I will answer you," came the familiar voice in the darkness. "I will tell you great and unsearchable things you do not know." The message that came to him there in the dungeon was one of the most beautiful and hopeful prophecies he had ever received. It spoke of a time when the city would be rebuilt, when the people would return from exile, when joy and celebration would once again fill the streets of Jerusalem. It was a promise of restoration so complete and wonderful that it seemed almost too good to be true. "I will bring health and healing to it," God promised. "I will heal my people and will let them enjoy abundant peace and security. I will bring Judah and Israel back from captivity, and will rebuild them as they were before. I will cleanse them from all the sin they have committed against me, and will forgive all their sins of rebellion against me. Then this city will bring me renown, joy, praise and honour before all nations on earth that hear of all the good things I do for it." Even as the sounds of warfare grew louder outside his prison walls, Jeremiah held on to these words of hope. The potter was still at work, still shaping, still creating something beautiful from the broken clay of human hearts and human history. When the city finally fell, it was as devastating as Jeremiah had predicted. The temple was destroyed, the walls torn down, the leaders killed or carried away into exile. The sight of Jerusalem in ruins was almost more than the prophet could bear. This was the city where God had chosen to dwell, the place where his people had worshipped for centuries. Now it lay in smoking rubble, its streets filled with the debris of a civilization that had forgotten its God. In the aftermath of the destruction, Jeremiah sat among the ruins and wept. The tears came not from a heart that said, "I told you so," but from one that was genuinely broken for the suffering of his people. He had warned them, yes, but he had never wanted to see them destroyed. He had hoped until the very end that they would turn back to God and avoid this terrible fate. It was then that he began to write what would become known as the Book of Lamentations, a collection of funeral songs for a dead city, poems of grief and mourning that captured the full depth of the tragedy that had befallen Jerusalem. But even in the midst of this profound sorrow, hope refused to be extinguished. "Because of the Lord's great love we are not consumed," he wrote, his hand trembling as he formed the words. "For his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." The words seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his own understanding, as if the Spirit of God was using his human grief to express a divine truth that transcended the immediate circumstances. Yes, Jerusalem had fallen. Yes, the people were scattered and the temple destroyed. But God's love had not failed. His faithfulness had not ended. His compassions were indeed new every morning, even in the darkest of times. "The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him," he continued, "to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord." As he wrote these words, Jeremiah began to understand something profound about the nature of hope. It wasn't based on circumstances or on the absence of suffering. True hope was rooted in the character of God himself, in his unchanging love and faithfulness. The potter might allow the clay to be broken, but he would never abandon it. He might permit the vessel to be shattered, but only so that he could create something even more beautiful from the pieces. "For no one is cast off by the Lord forever," he wrote, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love. For he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone." The ruins of Jerusalem became, in a strange way, a place of worship for Jeremiah. There among the broken stones and scattered debris, he found a closeness to God that he had never experienced before. The external symbols of faith were gone, but faith itself remained. The building had been destroyed, but the builder continued his work. People would come to him there, survivors of the siege who were struggling to make sense of what had happened. They would ask him why God had allowed such suffering, why the innocent had to pay for the sins of the guilty, why the city of God had been given over to pagan armies. "I cannot answer all your questions," Jeremiah would tell them gently, "but I can tell you what I've learned in my years of walking with the Lord. He is like a potter who shapes clay, and sometimes the shaping process is painful. But he never works without purpose. and he never abandons what he has begun. The vessel may be broken, but the potter's hands are still at work creating something new from the pieces. In the final years of his life, Jeremiah found himself in Egypt, carried there against his will by a group of Jewish refugees who feared remaining in the land of Judah. It was not where he had expected to end his days, far from the city he had loved and served for so many years. But even in this foreign land, he continued to speak the words God gave him, continued to comfort and challenge the people who had been scattered by the winds of history. As he sat one evening by the banks of the Nile watching the sunset over the ancient land of the Pharaohs, Jeremiah reflected on the long journey that had brought him to this place. He was no longer the young man who had trembled beneath the olive tree at his first calling. His hair was now white, his hands marked by years of writing and rewriting God's words, his heart scarred by decades of rejection and persecution. But he was not bitter. Somehow, through all the pain and struggle, he had learned to see his life as part of a larger tapestry that God was weaving through history. He was just one thread in that tapestry, but he had been woven in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, for exactly the right purpose. A young Jewish woman approached him as he sat by the water, her eyes reflecting the same uncertainty and pain he had seen in so many faces over the years. "Prophet," she said softly, "my heart is broken. I have lost everything. My home, my family, my future. How can I believe that God still cares about me?" Jeremiah smiled and gestured for her to sit beside him. "Let me tell you a story," he said, his voice warm with the wisdom of long experience. "Once God sent me to a potter's house to watch him work. The potter was shaping a vessel on his wheel, but something went wrong. The clay became marred, misshapen, useless for its intended purpose." The young woman leaned forward, intrigued despite her sorrow. "I expected the potter to throw the clay away," Jeremiah continued. "After all, it was ruined, wasn't it? But instead, he gathered it up and began again. He worked the clay, removed the impurities, and slowly shaped it into something new. The second vessel was different from the first, but it was beautiful in its own way. Perhaps even more beautiful because it bore the marks of the potter's patient love." "But what does this mean for me?" the woman asked. "How does this help me with my broken heart?" Jeremiah reached down and picked up a small piece of clay from the riverbank. "This is what God showed me that day," he said, working the clay gently in his hands. "You are not ruined, you are not beyond hope. You are clay in the potter's hands, and he is still shaping you. The breaking you've experienced is not the end of your story. It's the beginning of a new chapter." As he spoke, the clay in his hands began to take shape, becoming a small but perfectly formed vessel. "God's love is like this potter's skill," he continued. "It can take the most broken, damaged clay and create something beautiful from it. Your pain is not wasted. Your tears are not meaningless. They are part of the process by which God is making you into the person he always intended you to be." The woman began to weep, but they were not tears of despair. They were tears of hope, of recognition, of a heart that was beginning to heal. "How do you know this?" she whispered. "How can you be so sure?" Jeremiah smiled, and in that smile was the peace of a man who had wrestled with God and found him faithful. "Because I have been clay in the potter's hands for 40 years, he said simply. "I have been broken and reshaped more times than I can count. I have questioned, doubted, even tried to run away from his calling. But through it all, I have learned one thing. The potter never gives up on his clay. He never throws it away. He keeps working, keeps shaping, keeps creating until the vessel is exactly what he envisioned it to be." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jeremiah continued to speak with the young woman and others who had gathered around them. He told them of the promises God had made, of a time when the exiles would return, when the city would be rebuilt, when God would make a new covenant with his people. He reminded them that their current suffering was not the end of the story, but part of a larger narrative of redemption and restoration. "The potter is still at work," he said as the evening drew to a close. In your lives, in the life of our nation, in the great sweep of history itself, he's shaping something beautiful from the clay of human hearts and human history. Trust his hands, yield to his touch, and know that whatever he is creating in you and through you, it will be more wonderful than you can imagine. That night, as Jeremiah lay down to sleep, he thought once more of the potter's house and the lesson that had shaped his entire ministry. He had been privileged to be God's messenger, to speak his words to a generation that desperately needed to hear them. He had endured rejection, persecution, and exile, but he had also experienced the incredible intimacy of walking with God through every trial. His life had not been easy, but it had been meaningful. He had been clay in the potter's hands, shaped and reshaped according to God's perfect will. And though he would not live to see the full fulfillment of the promises he had proclaimed, he knew with absolute certainty that the potter's work would continue. The hands that had shaped him would continue to shape others, generation after generation, until the final masterpiece was complete. The last words he wrote in his journal that night were these: "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I will hope in him." And in the quiet darkness of a foreign land, far from the ruins of Jerusalem but close to the heart of God, Jeremiah slept peacefully, knowing that the potter's hands were still at work, still shaping, still creating something beautiful from the clay of human hearts. The message he had carried for 4 decades would outlive him, would speak to countless generations of broken people who needed to know that they were not beyond hope, that the potter never gives up on his clay, and that his love truly is new every morning. The story of Jeremiah reminds us that even in our darkest moments, even when our lives seem shattered beyond repair, we are never beyond the reach of the potter's hands. Like clay on the wheel, we may be broken, but we are never discarded. We are loved, shaped, and reshaped by hands that know exactly what we can become. And in the end, that is enough. That is everything. In the quietness of this story's end, may you find the peace that comes from knowing you too are clay in the potter's hands, being shaped with infinite love and patience into something beautiful beyond your wildest dreams. The potter is still at work, still shaping, still creating, and his love for you is new every morning. Hello dear friends, and welcome back to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I hope your day has been filled with blessings and peace. Whether it's morning where you are, the quiet of afternoon, or the gentle embrace of evening, know that you are exactly where God wants you to be in this moment. I'm curious about where in this beautiful world you're listening from tonight. Are you nestled in your bed in a bustling city, or perhaps finding solace in the countryside under a canopy of stars? Wherever you are, whatever time it is for you, you are welcomed here with open arms. If this story touches your heart tonight, I encourage you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber. We gather here regularly to explore the profound truths and timeless wisdom found in God's Word, bringing comfort to weary souls and strength to troubled hearts. Your subscription helps us continue sharing these sacred stories that remind us of God's unfailing love and faithfulness. Now let us journey together to ancient Israel, to a time when kingdoms stood at crossroads, when truth was a dangerous commodity, and when one man's courage would echo through the ages. This is the story of Micaiah, the forgotten prophet who dared to stand alone. The sun blazed mercilessly over the ancient city of Samaria, its golden rays dancing across the limestone walls of King Ahab's palace. Within those walls, power brooked no opposition, and truth was often the first casualty of political ambition. It had been 3 years since the last war between Israel and Syria, 3 years of uneasy peace that sat heavy on King Ahab's shoulders like an ill-fitting crown. Ahab paced the marble floors of his throne room, his royal robes rustling with each agitated step. The king of Israel was a man consumed by his desires, a ruler who had long ago traded his soul to the altar of self-interest. His marriage to the foreign princess Jezebel had brought prosperity to his kingdom, but at a cost that would echo through generations. The worship of Baal had infiltrated the very heart of Israel, and the prophets of the Lord had been hunted, killed, or driven into hiding. Yet today something stirred within Ahab's ambitious heart. News had arrived that morning of Syrian movements near Ramoth-Gilead, a strategic city that had once belonged to Israel, but now languished under enemy control. The city's location made it a prize worth fighting for, a gateway that could secure trade routes and strengthen his kingdom's eastern border. As Ahab contemplated this opportunity, word came that King Jehoshaphat of Judah was approaching Samaria with a considerable entourage. Jehoshaphat was everything Ahab was not, a king who sought the Lord's face, who had torn down the high places of idol worship, and who ruled with righteousness as his compass. The irony was not lost on Ahab that he would need the help of such a man to achieve his ambitions. The great doors of the throne room swung open with a resonant boom, and Jehoshaphat entered with the dignity befitting a king of David's lineage. He was a man of medium stature but commanding presence, his beard meticulously groomed, and his eyes holding the wisdom of one who had walked closely with the Almighty. Behind him came his advisors and military commanders, their expressions respectful but cautious, as they entered the domain of Israel's controversial king. "Jehoshaphat, my brother," Ahab called out, his voice echoing through the vast chamber as he descended from his throne. "Welcome to Samaria. Your presence brings honour to my house." The two kings embraced in the customary greeting, though those who knew them well could sense the underlying tension. Jehoshaphat had come seeking alliance, but his heart was troubled by what such an alliance might require of him. "Ahab," Jehoshaphat replied warmly, though his eyes remained watchful. "It has been too long since we have spoken face to face. The Lord has blessed both our kingdoms with peace these past years." "Indeed," Ahab agreed, gesturing toward the laden tables his servants had prepared. "Come, let us feast together and speak of matters that concern us both." The banquet that followed was a spectacle of royal excess. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, exotic fruits, and wine from the finest vineyards. Musicians played softly in the background, while servants moved like shadows, attending to every need. Yet beneath the veneer of celebration, both kings harboured their own purposes. As the evening wore on and the wine loosened tongues, Ahab finally revealed his true intention. Leaning toward Jehoshaphat with the conspiratorial air of old friends, he spoke in measured tones. "My brother, there is a matter that weighs heavily upon my heart," Ahab began, his eyes glinting in the torchlight. "You know that Ramoth-Gilead belongs to us, yet it remains in the hands of the king of Syria. Should we not take back what is rightfully ours?" Jehoshaphat set down his goblet carefully, his expression growing thoughtful. He had anticipated this moment, knowing that Ahab rarely extended hospitality without purpose. The question hung in the air between them like incense, heavy with implication. "Ramoth-Gilead has indeed been a source of contention," Jehoshaphat replied diplomatically. "What do you propose?" Ahab's smile was that of a merchant who senses a favourable negotiation. "I propose that we go up together against Ramoth-Gilead. Your army combined with mine would be formidable. We could restore the city to Israel and share in the glory of victory." The words were carefully chosen, appealing to both practical strategy and Jehoshaphat's sense of brotherhood among the tribes of Israel. Yet Jehoshaphat had not survived as king by making hasty decisions. His reign had been marked by careful consultation with the Lord, and he would not abandon that practice now. "I am as you are," Jehoshaphat responded slowly. "My people as your people, my horses as your horses. If the Lord wills it, we shall stand together in battle." He paused, his next words carrying the weight of true conviction. "But first let us inquire of the Lord." Ahab's smile faltered slightly. In his eagerness for military glory, he had hoped to avoid the complications that divine consultation might bring. Yet he could hardly refuse such a reasonable request from a potential ally, especially one whose righteousness was renowned throughout the region. "Of course," Ahab agreed, though his tone lacked enthusiasm. "Let us seek the word of the Lord." What followed was a demonstration of the spiritual corruption that had infected Ahab's court. The king summoned his prophets, all 400 of them, men who wore the garments of holiness, but whose hearts served earthly masters. They came in a great procession, their robes flowing and their voices raised in what appeared to be spiritual fervour. These were not true prophets of the Lord, though they claimed his name. They were court prophets, men who understood that their continued prosperity depended upon telling the king what he wished to hear. Their prophecies were crafted not in the secret place of prayer, but in the calculating chambers of political expediency. As the prophets assembled in the courtyard before the two kings, their spokesman stepped forward. His name was Zedekiah, son of Chenaanah, a man whose pride matched his ambition, and whose hatred for true prophets would soon be revealed in violent fashion. "Hear the word of the Lord," Zedekiah proclaimed, his voice carrying across the courtyard with theatrical intensity. "Go up to Ramoth-Gilead and prosper, for the Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." The 400 prophets took up the cry with orchestrated precision, their voices creating a chorus of false assurance. "Go up to Ramoth-Gilead and prosper. The Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." Some of the prophets had even prepared visual aids for their performance. They danced and shouted, waving swords and spears, creating a spectacle that would have been impressive to any observer unfamiliar with the ways of true prophecy. The din was tremendous, the enthusiasm seemingly genuine, and the message exactly what Ahab longed to hear. Yet as Jehoshaphat watched this display, his spirit grew troubled. Something about the performance felt hollow, manufactured. These men spoke with one voice, but it was not the voice of the Lord that Jehoshaphat knew from his own times of prayer and seeking. There was no cost to their prophecy, no challenge to the king's desires, no hint of the divine complexity that marked true encounters with the Almighty. As the prophets continued their enthusiastic proclamations, Jehoshaphat raised his hand for silence. The courtyard gradually quieted, though the echo of their shouts seemed to linger in the air like smoke from a dying fire. "Is there not here a prophet of the Lord besides these?" Jehoshaphat asked carefully, "that we might inquire of him?" The question fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of discomfort through the assembly. Ahab's face darkened, and several of the court prophets exchanged meaningful glances. They all knew there was indeed another prophet, one whose very existence was a thorn in the flesh of everyone present. Ahab's response came through gritted teeth, his voice barely concealing his irritation. "There is still one man, Micaiah the son of Imlah, by whom we may inquire of the Lord. But I hate him, for he does not prophesy good concerning me, but evil." The honesty of Ahab's admission was startling in its nakedness. Here was a king openly declaring his hatred for a prophet based not on any moral failing or false prophecy, but simply because the man refused to tell him what he wanted to hear. It was a moment that revealed the true spiritual state of Israel's leadership. Jehoshaphat, ever the diplomat, sought to smooth over the awkward moment. "Let not the king say such things," he replied gently, though his words carried a subtle rebuke. Ahab realized he had revealed too much of his heart. With visible effort he composed himself and called for one of his officers. "Bring Micaiah the son of Imlah quickly," he commanded, though his tone suggested he would rather summon a plague upon his house. As the officer hurried away on his grim errand, the two kings settled in to wait. The 400 prophets remained in the courtyard, their earlier enthusiasm now tempered by the knowledge that their unanimous voice was about to be challenged by a single man they both feared and despised. The sun continued its relentless journey across the sky, and in the distance the sound of the officer's horse could be heard galloping toward the place where truth dwelt in isolation, where a forgotten prophet waited in the shadows of his integrity. The horse's hooves struck the dusty road with rhythmic precision, as the king's officer rode toward the humble dwelling where Micaiah made his home. The prophet lived simply, far from the luxury of the royal court, in a stone house that spoke of function rather than ostentation. Here, away from the corrupting influence of political power, dwelt a man who had chosen faithfulness over favour, truth over comfort. Micaiah, son of Imlah, was not an imposing figure by earthly standards. Of average height and lean build, he bore the weathered appearance of one who had walked through many storms. His beard was streaked with silver, and his eyes held the deep weariness of a man who had spoken unpopular truths for too many years. Yet there was something unbreakable in his demeanour, a quality that suggested he had found his anchor in something far stronger than human approval. When the king's messenger arrived, Micaiah was in his garden, tending to the vegetables that provided much of his sustenance. The prophet lived modestly, supported by the occasional gifts of those few souls who still valued truth above comfort. He had long ago learned to find contentment in simple things, the satisfaction of honest work, the peace of prayer, and the quiet joy of communion with the Almighty. "Micaiah," the officer called out as he dismounted, "the king commands your presence immediately." The prophet looked up from his work, unsurprised. He had sensed in recent days that the Lord was preparing him for something significant. His prayers had been marked by an unusual intensity, and his dreams had been filled with visions he did not yet fully understand. "Very well," Micaiah replied simply, setting aside his tools. "Let me wash and prepare myself." As Micaiah went about the task of making himself presentable for the royal court, the officer felt compelled to share information that might save the prophet from making a costly mistake. The man had witnessed what happened to those who crossed King Ahab, and despite his loyalty to the crown, he possessed enough humanity to feel concern for this solitary figure. "Listen to me, Micaiah," the officer said, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "The words of the prophets declare good to the king with one mouth. Let your word be like the word of one of them, and speak favourably." It was well-intentioned advice, offered by a man who understood the political realities of Ahab's court. The officer had seen the 400 prophets deliver their unanimous message of victory and prosperity. He knew that Micaiah's reputation for speaking uncomfortable truths could lead to imprisonment, exile, or worse. In his mind, he was offering the prophet a lifeline, a chance to align himself with the majority and avoid the consequences of standing alone. Micaiah paused in his preparations, considering the messenger's words. The offer was clear: conform, agree with the crowd, tell the king what he wants to hear, and enjoy the benefits of royal favour. It would be so easy, so practical, so utterly reasonable by every human measure. But as Micaiah looked into the officer's earnest face, he felt the familiar stirring of the spirit within him, that unmistakable presence that had guided him through decades of faithful service. The Lord had not called him to an easy path, but he had never failed to provide strength for the journey. "As the Lord lives," Micaiah replied with quiet dignity, "whatever the Lord says to me, that I will speak." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration of absolute commitment that left no room for compromise. The officer's face showed his disappointment and concern, but he knew better than to argue further. He had delivered his warning. What the prophet did with it was beyond his control. The journey back to Samaria was made in relative silence, the officer pondering the stubborn integrity of his passenger, while Micaiah prayed and prepared his heart for whatever lay ahead. As they approached the city, the prophet could see the banners of both Israel and Judah flying from the palace walls, confirming his suspicion that this summons involved more than a routine consultation. The palace courtyard was a scene of controlled chaos when they arrived. Servants scurried about preparing for what appeared to be an important gathering, while guards stood at attention in their finest armour. The 400 prophets were still present, clustered in small groups and speaking in hushed tones. Their earlier enthusiasm had given way to a more subdued attitude, though their confidence in their message remained unshaken. As Micaiah dismounted and followed the officer toward the throne room, he could feel the weight of many eyes upon him. Some looks were curious, others hostile, and a few held the barely concealed contempt of those who viewed his independence as a personal affront. He had grown accustomed to such reactions over the years, understanding that his very presence served as an uncomfortable reminder of the spiritual compromise that permeated the court. The great doors opened before them, revealing the opulent throne room where Kings Ahab and Jehoshaphat waited. The contrast between the two rulers was immediately apparent even to a casual observer. Ahab sat upon his throne with the restless energy of a man driven by ambition, his fingers drumming impatiently on the armrest. Jehoshaphat, seated in a chair of equal honour nearby, maintained the composed dignity of one accustomed to seeking divine guidance before making important decisions. "Ah, Micaiah," Ahab said as the prophet entered, his tone carrying forced joviality that fooled no one. "At last, our final consultant arrives." Micaiah approached the throne with measured steps, neither hurrying to show deference nor dawdling to display defiance. He had learned long ago that in the presence of earthly power, his allegiance belonged to a higher authority. When he reached the appropriate distance, he bowed respectfully but not obsequiously, acknowledging the king's position without compromising his own integrity. "You summoned me, Your Majesty," Micaiah said simply, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. King Jehoshaphat studied the prophet with interest. He had heard reports of Micaiah's reputation for uncompromising honesty, and after witnessing the theatrical performance of the 400 prophets, he was eager to hear from someone who might offer a different perspective. Ahab leaned forward on his throne, his eyes fixed on the solitary figure before him. "Micaiah, shall we go to war against Ramoth-Gilead, or shall we refrain?" It was the same question that had been posed to the 400 prophets, the same inquiry that had produced such enthusiastic unanimity. Now it fell upon the shoulders of one man who stood alone, without allies or supporters, facing the combined expectation of two kings and their assembled courts. The moment stretched taut with anticipation. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something significant, though few could have predicted the drama that was about to unfold. In the silence, Micaiah felt the familiar stirring of the spirit, but what came first was not the word of the Lord, but something altogether unexpected. What happened next would be remembered and debated for generations to come. Micaiah, the prophet known for his uncompromising honesty, looked directly at King Ahab and delivered exactly the message the king wanted to hear. "Go up and prosper," Micaiah declared, his voice carrying throughout the throne room, "for the Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." A murmur of surprise rippled through the assembled court. The 400 prophets exchanged glances of confusion and perhaps a touch of irritation. Here was the man they had feared would contradict their unanimous verdict, and instead he was confirming their prophecy word for word. Some of them smiled with what they imagined was vindication, while others seemed puzzled by this unexpected development. But King Ahab was no fool. Despite his many moral failings, he had known Micaiah for years, had heard his prophecies of judgment and warning countless times. Never once had the prophet told him what he wanted to hear. Never once had Micaiah's words aligned so perfectly with royal desires. The king's eyes narrowed as he studied the prophet's face, searching for the truth behind this suspicious compliance. There was something in Micaiah's tone, a subtle quality that suggested layers beneath the surface of his words. It was the same tone a parent might use when agreeing with a child's obviously foolish plan, allowing them to proceed while knowing full well what the consequences would be. King Jehoshaphat, too, sensed that something was amiss, though he remained silent, observing the interaction with keen interest. "How many times shall I make you swear," Ahab said slowly, his voice carrying a warning, "that you tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord?" It was a remarkable moment. Here was a king who had just received exactly the prophecy he desired, yet his own conscience convicted him that it could not be genuine. Ahab understood Micaiah well enough to know that such easy agreement was completely out of character. In demanding the truth, the king was inadvertently acknowledging that he recognized the difference between authentic prophecy and the comfortable lies he typically preferred. Micaiah stood silent for a moment, and those watching could see a visible change come over him. The sardonic expression faded from his face, replaced by the solemn countenance of one who was about to deliver a message from the throne room of heaven. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality altogether, the unmistakable authority of divine revelation. "I saw all Israel scattered on the hills like sheep that have no shepherd," Micaiah began, his words falling like stones into the sudden silence. "And the Lord said, 'These have no master. Let each return to his house in peace.'" The impact of these words was immediate and devastating. The vision was clear to everyone present. Israel would be defeated, their army scattered, and their king would not return from battle. It was a prophecy of military disaster and royal death, delivered with the calm certainty of one who had seen beyond the veil of earthly circumstances. King Ahab's face flushed with anger, but beneath the rage was something that looked remarkably like fear. He turned to Jehoshaphat with the bitter satisfaction of one whose worst expectations have been confirmed. "Did I not tell you," Ahab said, his voice heavy with frustration, "that he would not prophesy good concerning me, but evil?" But Micaiah was not finished. The Spirit of the Lord had opened his eyes to see into the very council chambers of heaven, and what he had witnessed there needed to be shared, regardless of the consequences. The prophet's voice took on an even more solemn tone as he continued. "Therefore hear the word of the Lord," Micaiah declared, his words cutting through the tension in the room like a sword. "I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing by, on his right hand and on his left." The court fell absolutely silent. Even the most worldly and cynical among them recognized that they were hearing something extraordinary. This was not the political manoeuvring they were accustomed to, nor the comfortable reassurances of the court prophets. This was a glimpse into eternal realities, a revelation of divine purpose that transcended human understanding. "And the Lord said," Micaiah continued, "Who will persuade Ahab to go up, that he may fall at Ramoth-Gilead?" So one spoke in this manner, and another spoke in that manner. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord and said, "I will persuade him." The Lord said to him, "In what way?" And he said, "I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets." And the Lord said, "You shall persuade him and also prevail. Go out and do so." The revelation was staggering in its implications. Micaiah was claiming that the Lord himself had allowed, indeed, had orchestrated, the deception that had been proclaimed by the 400 prophets. It was a divine judgment in the form of false prophecy, a spiritual trap set for a king who had repeatedly chosen lies over truth. "Therefore," Micaiah concluded with inexorable logic, "look, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these prophets of yours, and the Lord has declared disaster concerning you." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person present was forced to grapple with the implications of what they had heard. The 400 prophets found themselves accused not merely of error, but of being unwitting instruments of divine deception. The kings faced the terrifying possibility that their carefully planned military campaign was actually a trap set by the Almighty himself. But the silence was short-lived. Zedekiah, the spokesman for the 400 prophets, was a man of considerable pride and ambition. He had built his reputation on his supposed connection to the divine, and Micaiah's words threatened not only his credibility but his entire worldview. The accusation that he had been deceived by a lying spirit was more than he could bear. With a roar of rage, Zedekiah strode across the throne room until he stood face to face with Micaiah. The contrast between them was striking. Zedekiah in his fine robes and carefully groomed appearance, representing the comfortable religiosity of the court, facing Micaiah in his simple garments, embodying the uncompromising voice of authentic prophecy. "Which way did the Spirit from the Lord go from me to speak to you?" Zedekiah demanded, his voice shaking with fury. It was a desperate attempt to challenge Micaiah's authority, to suggest that if anyone possessed a connection to the divine, it was surely the spokesman for 400 prophets rather than this isolated troublemaker. But before Micaiah could respond, Zedekiah's anger overwhelmed his judgment entirely. The sound of the slap echoed through the throne room like a thunderclap. Zedekiah had struck Micaiah across the face with sufficient force to stagger the prophet, leaving a red mark on his cheek that would serve as a visible reminder of what it cost to speak truth in the face of comfortable lies. The act of violence hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. No one moved or spoke, shocked by the sudden transition from theological debate to physical assault. Micaiah slowly straightened, touching his cheek where Zedekiah's hand had left its mark. When he looked up, there was no anger in his eyes, no desire for retaliation. Instead, there was a sadness that seemed to encompass not only his immediate situation, but the entire spiritual state of the nation. "Indeed," Micaiah said quietly, his voice carrying despite its gentle tone, "you shall see on that day when you go into an inner chamber to hide." It was both prophecy and promise. The day would come when Zedekiah's false confidence would crumble, when the reality of divine judgment would force him to seek shelter from the consequences of his deception. The words carried the weight of inevitable fulfillment, spoken not in anger, but with the sorrowful certainty of one who had seen the future and found it tragic. King Ahab had heard enough. The prophet's words had struck too close to uncomfortable truths, had challenged too directly the comfortable illusions upon which he had built his reign. The vision of divine deception, the prophecy of military disaster, the humiliating suggestion that his 400 prophets were unwitting instruments of judgment, all of it combined to create a rage that demanded immediate action. "Take Micaiah," the king commanded, his voice sharp with fury, "and return him to Amon, the governor of the city, and to Joash the king's son, and say, 'Thus says the king, put this fellow in prison, and feed him with bread of affliction and water of affliction until I come in peace.'" The order was both punishment and insurance policy. By imprisoning Micaiah until his safe return from battle, Ahab was attempting to nullify the prophecy through royal decree. It was a desperate act of defiance against divine judgment, a futile attempt to bind the word of the Lord with chains and prison walls. But Micaiah was not finished. Even as the guards moved toward him, even as the shadow of imprisonment fell across his path, the prophet had one final word to speak. His voice rang out across the throne room with the clarity of absolute conviction. "If you ever return in peace, the Lord has not spoken by me." The words were a direct challenge to royal authority, a public declaration that put Micaiah's credibility as a prophet on the line. He was essentially saying that if Ahab returned safely from battle, then everyone present should conclude that Micaiah was a false prophet deserving of death. It was the ultimate expression of confidence in the word he had received from the Lord. But Micaiah was not content to let his challenge rest with the immediate audience. Looking around the throne room at the assembled courtiers, nobles and servants, he raised his voice even louder. "Mark it, all you people." It was a call to witness, an appeal to everyone present to remember this moment and test the validity of his prophecy against future events. The prophet was willing to stake everything, his reputation, his freedom, possibly his life, on the truth of what he had spoken. It was a level of certainty that transcended human confidence and entered the realm of divine assurance. As the guards seized Micaiah's arms and began to lead him away, the throne room erupted in a buzz of conversation. Some whispered among themselves about the prophet's boldness, others debated the implications of his vision, and still others tried to process the dramatic confrontation they had just witnessed. Through it all, the 400 prophets maintained their uncomfortable silence, uncertain how to respond to accusations that struck at the very heart of their prophetic claims. King Jehoshaphat watched the proceedings with deep concern. The righteous king of Judah had requested divine counsel, and what he had received was a prophecy that directly contradicted his military plans and predicted disaster for his ally. Yet something in Micaiah's bearing, some quality of authentic conviction, made it impossible to dismiss his words as the ravings of a madman or the spite of a disgruntled prophet. As Micaiah was led away, his footsteps echoing through the palace corridors, he felt no bitterness toward his captors or self-pity for his situation. He had spoken the word of the Lord faithfully, regardless of the consequences, and that obedience brought a peace that transcended his circumstances. The prison cell that awaited him might confine his body, but his spirit remained free, anchored in the unshakable certainty that he had been faithful to his calling. The cell where Micaiah was imprisoned was a far cry from the luxury of the royal court. Built of rough stone with a small barred window that provided minimal light, it was designed for punishment rather than comfort. The The bread of affliction and water of affliction promised by the king proved to be exactly that. Meagre rations calculated to sustain life while providing a constant reminder of a royal displeasure. Yet in that dark cell, Micaiah found something that had eluded him in the freedom of his simple home. Absolute clarity about his purpose and calling. Stripped of all earthly comforts and securities, he was forced to rely entirely upon his relationship with the Lord. In the long hours of solitude, he prayed not for deliverance but for continued faithfulness, not for vindication, but for grace to endure whatever lay ahead. Meanwhile, preparations for war continued with increasing intensity. King Ahab threw himself into military planning with the fervour of a man trying to drown out unwelcome voices of conscience. He consulted with his generals, inspected his troops, and made elaborate arrangements for what he was determined would be a glorious victory. The prophecy of the 400 court prophets was repeated frequently, as if constant repetition could somehow make it more reliable. King Jehoshaphat, however, found himself deeply troubled by the day's events. The contrast between the theatrical unanimity of the 400 prophets and Micaiah's stark authenticity had left him with serious doubts about the wisdom of the planned campaign. Yet he had given his word to stand with Ahab, and the political implications of backing out now were significant. As the day of departure approached, Ahab made one final attempt to circumvent the prophecy that haunted his thoughts. If the word of the Lord through Micaiah was true, then King Ahab was destined to die in battle. But perhaps, the king reasoned, he could outwit divine judgment through human cleverness. "I will disguise myself and go into battle," Ahab announced to his commanders, "but you put on your robes." It was a cunning plan. By dressing as an ordinary soldier while Jehoshaphat wore royal garments, Ahab hoped to deceive the enemy about his identity and location. If the Syrians could not identify him as the king of Israel, perhaps he could survive the battle and prove Micaiah wrong. It was the kind of tactical thinking that had served Ahab well in political manoeuvring. But he was about to discover that divine judgment operates by different rules than human conflict. The morning of battle dawned clear and bright, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers across the plains surrounding Ramoth Gilead. It seemed an unlikely day for the fulfillment of prophecy, too beautiful for the tragic events that were about to unfold. The armies of Israel and Judah had assembled in impressive formation, their banners flying proudly in the morning air, their weapons gleaming in the sunlight. King Ahab, disguised as a common soldier, moved among his troops with nervous energy. His royal armour had been replaced with the simple leather and bronze of an ordinary warrior, and his distinctive crown was nowhere to be seen. To any casual observer, he appeared to be merely another commander preparing for battle, yet those closest to him could sense his underlying anxiety, the tension of a man who was trying to outrun a divine decree. King Jehoshaphat, meanwhile, wore his royal robes with obvious reluctance. The righteous king of Judah had agreed to this deception as part of their military strategy, but his conscience troubled him. The memory of Micaiah's words weighed heavily on his mind, and he found himself offering frequent prayers for divine protection and guidance. The Syrian army was formidable, well-trained and confident in their ability to defend their territory. Their king had given specific instructions to his 32 chariot commanders: fight with no one small or great, but only with the king of Israel. It was a strategic decision based on the understanding that killing or capturing the enemy king would effectively end the battle and secure victory. As the two armies faced each other across the field of battle, the air was thick with tension and anticipation. Horses stamped impatiently, armour creaked as soldiers shifted their weight, and commanders made final adjustments to their battle plans. In the distance, the walls of Ramoth Gilead stood as silent witness to the conflict that was about to determine its fate. The battle began with the thunderous clash of armies colliding, the sound of metal against metal mixing with the shouts of warriors and the screams of the wounded. Chariots raced across the battlefield like instruments of divine wrath, their wheels churning up clouds of dust that obscured vision and added to the chaos of combat. For a time, it seemed as though Ahab's strategy might succeed. Hidden among his soldiers, the disguised king fought with the desperation of a man who believed his life depended on remaining unrecognized. His years of military experience served him well as he wielded sword and spear with deadly efficiency, contributing to the initial success of the Israelite forces. But the Syrian chariot commanders were not easily deceived. When they spotted King Jehoshaphat in his royal robes, they immediately assumed they had found their primary target. A group of them converged on the king of Judah with deadly intent, their chariots cutting through the battle lines like ships through stormy seas. "Surely it is the king of Israel," they shouted to one another as they closed in on Jehoshaphat. The king of Judah found himself surrounded by enemy chariots, their occupants preparing to capture or kill what they believed to be their primary objective. In that moment of extreme danger, Jehoshaphat did what he had learned to do throughout his reign. He cried out to the Lord for deliverance. "Help me, O Lord," Jehoshaphat called out, his voice carrying above the din of battle. What happened next was a clear demonstration of divine intervention. As Jehoshaphat's cry reached heaven, the Lord moved the hearts of the Syrian commanders in an unexpected way. Something about the king's appearance or manner suddenly convinced them that this was not their intended target after all. "It is not the king of Israel," one of them declared, and just as quickly as they had converged upon Jehoshaphat, they turned away to search for their real quarry elsewhere on the battlefield. Meanwhile, across the chaos of combat, King Ahab continued his desperate masquerade. His disguise had served him well throughout the morning, allowing him to participate in the battle without attracting the special attention of enemy forces. For a brief moment, it seemed as though human cunning might indeed triumph over divine decree. But the Lord's purposes are not thwarted by earthly schemes, no matter how cleverly conceived. As the battle raged on, a Syrian soldier drew his bow at random, not aiming at any particular target, but simply shooting into the mass of enemy forces. It was the kind of arrow that soldiers loose when they cannot see clearly, through the dust and confusion of battle, hoping to strike something useful, but with no specific intent. The arrow flew through the air with the invisible guidance of divine providence. It passed over the heads of common soldiers, sailed between the wheels of racing chariots, and found its mark with the precision of perfect justice. The bronze point struck King Ahab between the joints of his armour, penetrating the one gap in his defences that his disguise could not protect. The king felt the arrow's impact like a thunderbolt, the sudden sharp pain followed by the warm spread of blood across his chest. He looked down in shock to see the Syrian arrow protruding from his body, its shaft trembling with the force of impact. In that instant, Ahab understood with perfect clarity that no amount of human cleverness could circumvent the word of the Lord. "I am wounded," the king cried out to his chariot driver, his voice tight with pain and the dawning realization of his doom. "Turn around and carry me out of the battle." The chariot driver, a loyal servant who had recognized his disguised king despite the common soldier's garb, immediately began maneuvering toward the edge of the battlefield. But extricating themselves from the chaos of combat proved more difficult than anticipated. The battle had intensified throughout the day, and enemy forces blocked many of the potential escape routes. As they struggled to retreat, King Ahab's condition continued to deteriorate. The arrow had found a vital spot, and blood flowed freely from the wound despite his attempts to stanch it. Yet with grim determination, the king remained propped up in his chariot, unwilling to let his army see him fall. His presence, even in his wounded state, served to encourage the Israelite forces and maintain their fighting spirit. The battle raged from morning until evening, the outcome hanging in the balance as both sides fought with desperate intensity. But as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed to mirror the blood spilled on the battlefield below, King Ahab's strength finally gave out. The disguised king who had tried to outwit divine judgment slumped forward in his chariot, his life ebbing away with each laboured breath. As word of the king's condition spread through the ranks, the cry went up that would fulfill Micaiah's prophecy with devastating accuracy. Every man to his city, and every man to his own country. The army of Israel, leaderless and demoralized, began to scatter across the hills just as the prophet had foreseen. Like sheep without a shepherd, they abandoned their positions and fled toward home, their dreams of victory dissolving into the nightmare of defeat. King Ahab died as the sun set over Ramoth-Gilead, his blood pooling in the bottom of his chariot. The man who had spent his reign choosing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths had finally encountered a reality that no amount of deception could alter. The word of the Lord, spoken through his faithful prophet, had been fulfilled to the letter. News of King Ahab's death spread quickly through the land, carried by the scattered remnants of his army and the merchants who followed military campaigns. In the palace at Samaria, the reaction was one of stunned disbelief. The 400 prophets who had proclaimed certain victory found themselves facing a crisis of credibility that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In his prison cell, Micaiah heard the news with a mixture of sadness and vindication. He had taken no pleasure in prophesying disaster, had felt no joy in predicting the death of his king. Yet the fulfillment of his prophecy served as a powerful reminder that the word of the Lord does not return void, regardless of how unwelcome it might be to human ears. When the guards came to release him from prison, Micaiah emerged into the daylight a changed man. His body bore the marks of his confinement. He was thinner, paler, and bore the lines of one who had endured hardship. But his spirit was unbroken, perhaps even strengthened by his ordeal. He had spoken truth in the face of overwhelming opposition, had maintained his integrity under pressure, and had been vindicated by the very events that had brought tragedy to the kingdom. The political ramifications of Ahab's death were immediate and far-reaching. His son Ahaziah ascended to the throne, inheriting a kingdom shaken by military defeat and spiritual confusion. The influence of Queen Jezebel remained strong, but the dramatic fulfillment of Micaiah's prophecy had dealt a severe blow to the credibility of the Baal-worshipping establishment. Zedekiah, the false prophet who had struck Micaiah in the throne room, found himself in an impossible position. His confident predictions of victory had been thoroughly discredited, and his authority as a spokesman for the divine had been shattered. The inner chamber where he sought to hide, just as Micaiah had prophesied, became both a physical and spiritual reality as he struggled to come to terms with the magnitude of his error. The other court prophets faced similar crises of confidence. Their unanimous declaration of victory had been revealed as the lying spirit Micaiah had warned about, and their reputations lay in ruins. Some of them quietly retired from public life, while others attempted to reinvent themselves as followers of different deities. None of them could escape the uncomfortable truth that they had been deceived, and had, in turn, deceived others. King Jehoshaphat returned to Jerusalem a wiser and more cautious man. His alliance with Ahab had nearly cost him his life, and the experience had taught him valuable lessons about the importance of seeking genuine divine guidance rather than accepting comfortable confirmations of predetermined plans. The prophet Jehu, son of Hanani, met him upon his return with words of rebuke for his alliance with the ungodly king, but also with recognition that the Lord had delivered him from the consequences of his poor judgment. Throughout the kingdom, people began to reassess their understanding of prophecy and divine revelation. The dramatic contrast between the false assurances of the 400 prophets and the accurate warnings of the solitary Micaiah had provided a vivid lesson in discernment. Many began to understand that true prophecy was not measured by its popularity or its agreement with human desires, but by its faithfulness to the word and character of the Lord. Years passed, and the story of Micaiah's stand against the 400 false prophets became one of the most remembered episodes in the history of Israel. Parents told it to their children as an example of courage and integrity, while religious teachers used it to illustrate the difference between true and false prophecy. The tale grew in significance with each telling, not because it was embellished, but because its lessons proved to be timeless and universal. The first and most obvious lesson was about the cost of speaking truth. Micaiah had paid a heavy price for his faithfulness: imprisonment, isolation, and the hostility of the powerful. Yet his willingness to endure these hardships had ultimately served a greater purpose, preserving the integrity of prophetic ministry and providing a clear example of what it meant to fear God rather than man. His story became a source of encouragement for future generations of prophets and faithful believers who found themselves standing alone against popular opinion. The second lesson concerned the danger of groupthink and manufactured consensus. The 400 prophets had created an impressive display of unanimity, but their agreement had been based on political expediency rather than divine revelation. Their story served as a warning about the seductive power of majority opinion and the importance of seeking truth, even when it contradicted popular sentiment. The comfort of belonging to the crowd, they learned, was no substitute for the sometimes lonely path of authentic faith. The third lesson was perhaps the most theologically complex: the reality that God sometimes allows deception as a form of judgment. The lying spirit that had influenced the false prophets was not an independent force, but an instrument of divine justice, permitted by the Lord as part of his sovereign plan. This aspect of the story forced believers to grapple with difficult questions about the nature of divine sovereignty and human responsibility, helping them develop a more mature understanding of how God works in the world. The fourth lesson focused on the importance of discernment in spiritual matters. King Jehoshaphat's initial uneasiness with the 400 prophets had been a manifestation of spiritual discernment, a recognition that something was amiss despite the impressive display of consensus. His request for a prophet of the Lord had demonstrated the value of seeking authentic divine guidance rather than accepting convenient confirmations of predetermined plans. The fifth lesson was about the ultimate futility of human schemes when they oppose divine purposes. King Ahab's elaborate disguise had been a clever attempt to circumvent prophecy through human ingenuity, but it had proven utterly useless against the sovereign will of the Lord. The random arrow that found its mark had served as a powerful reminder that God's purposes will be accomplished regardless of human attempts to thwart them. As the years passed and the kingdom of Israel continued its spiritual decline, the story of Micaiah took on additional significance. It became a benchmark against which other prophets and prophecies were measured, a reminder of what authentic faithfulness looked like in the face of opposition. When Elijah stood alone against the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, people remembered Micaiah's solitary stand. When Jeremiah faced persecution for his unpopular messages, the example of Micaiah's courage provided encouragement and precedent. The story also served as a cautionary tale for those in positions of authority. King Ahab's admission that he hated Micaiah because the prophet never spoke favourably about him had revealed the dangerous tendency of leaders to surround themselves with yes men rather than truthful counsellors. Future kings and officials who heard the story were challenged to examine their own relationships with advisors and to consider whether they were seeking truth or merely confirmation of their existing beliefs. In the quiet of his later years, Micaiah often reflected on that pivotal day when he had stood alone before 2 kings and 400 false prophets. The physical scars from his imprisonment had faded, but the spiritual impact of his experience continued to shape his understanding of his calling and his relationship with the Lord. The prophet had learned that faithfulness was not measured by immediate results, but by obedience to divine instruction. His warning had not prevented the battle or saved King Ahab's life, but it had preserved the integrity of prophetic ministry and provided a clear demonstration of the difference between true and false revelation. Sometimes, he realized, the greatest victories were won not through changing circumstances, but through maintaining faithfulness in the midst of difficult circumstances. Micaiah had also discovered that standing alone was not the same as being alone. In his prison cell, deprived of human companionship and comfort, he had experienced a deeper intimacy with the Lord than he had ever known before. The isolation that had seemed like punishment had actually become a pathway to greater spiritual understanding and strength. He had learned that the approval of the crowd was a poor substitute for the approval of the Almighty. The prophet had come to understand that his role was not to be popular, but to be faithful, not to tell people what they wanted to hear, but to speak what the Lord had given him to say. This understanding had freed him from the burden of trying to manage people's reactions to his messages, and had allowed him to focus entirely on the sacred responsibility of accurate communication of divine truth. The peace that came from this clarity of purpose was worth more than all the royal favour he might have gained through compromise. As news of Micaiah's faithfulness spread beyond the borders of Israel, his story began to influence other nations and cultures. Foreign dignitaries who visited the kingdom often asked to hear the account of the prophet who had stood against 400 false prophets and accurately predicted the death of a king. The story became a testament to the power of truth and the importance of moral courage, inspiring people of various backgrounds to examine their own commitments to integrity and faithfulness. The story also had a profound impact on the understanding of prophecy itself. Future generations would use Micaiah's example as a standard for evaluating prophetic claims, recognizing that true prophecy was characterized by faithfulness to the Lord's character and purposes rather than by popular appeal or immediate gratification. The account helped establish criteria for distinguishing between authentic divine revelation and human manipulation disguised as spiritual authority. In the broader context of Israel's history, Micaiah's stand represented a crucial moment in the preservation of true worship and authentic faith. At a time when the kingdom was sliding towards spiritual apostasy, his unwavering commitment to truth served as a beacon of hope for those who still sought to follow the Lord with integrity. His example encouraged other faithful believers to maintain their convictions even when they seemed to be in the minority. The story of Micaiah also served as a bridge between the ministries of the earlier prophets like Elijah and later ones like Jeremiah and Ezekiel. His experience of standing alone against popular opinion and suffering for his faithfulness would be echoed in the lives of many subsequent prophets who faced similar challenges. The patterns of persecution, vindication, and ultimate triumph that characterized his story became recurring themes in the ongoing narrative of God's relationship with his people. As we reach the end of Micaiah's story, we find ourselves confronted with questions that transcend the ancient world and speak directly to our modern hearts. In an age of social media echo chambers and manufactured consensus, the prophet's example challenges us to examine our own commitment to truth and our willingness to stand alone when necessary. The 400 false prophets of Micaiah's day have their counterparts in every generation. Those who tell us what we want to hear rather than what we need to hear, who offer comfortable lies instead of challenging truths. The temptation to join the crowd, to find safety in numbers, to seek approval rather than accuracy, remains as strong today as it was in ancient Israel. Micaiah's courage reminds us that faithfulness is not a group activity, but an individual responsibility. Each of us must decide whether we will speak truth or remain silent, whether we will stand for what is right or compromise for what is convenient. The prophet's example shows us that the path of integrity is often lonely, but it is never walked alone by those who trust in the Lord. The story also challenges us to examine our own relationship with authority and our tendency to surround ourselves with people who confirm our existing beliefs rather than challenging us to grow. Like King Ahab, we may find ourselves preferring the comfort of familiar lies to the discomfort of unfamiliar truths. Micaiah's example calls us to seek out voices that speak with authenticity, rather than those that merely echo our own opinions. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Micaiah reminds us that truth has a way of prevailing in the end, even when it seems overwhelmed by opposition. The prophet's vindication did not come immediately, and it came at great personal cost, but it came nonetheless. His example encourages us to trust in the ultimate triumph of truth, and to remain faithful even when the outcome is uncertain. In our own lives, we may face moments when we are called to be like Micaiah, to stand alone against popular opinion, to speak uncomfortable truths, to choose faithfulness over favour. When those moments come, may we remember the forgotten prophet who found his courage not in the approval of men, but in the approval of his God. The story of Micaiah teaches us that true strength is not found in numbers, but in conviction, that real courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what is right despite our fears, and that lasting victory comes not from avoiding conflict, but from maintaining integrity in the midst of it. As you close your eyes tonight and drift towards sleep, may you carry with you the quiet courage of Micaiah, the man who dared to stand alone because he knew he was not truly alone. May his example inspire you to speak truth with love, to stand for what is right with humility, and to trust in the ultimate triumph of God's purposes even when the immediate circumstances seem overwhelming. In a world that often rewards conformity and punishes authenticity, may you find the strength to be like Micaiah, faithful, courageous, and true. For in the end, it is not the approval of the crowd that matters, but the approval of the one who sees all hearts and knows all truths. The forgotten prophet's story ends, but its echo continues in every heart that chooses truth over comfort, courage over convenience, and faithfulness over favour. May that echo sound clearly in your own life, guiding you toward the kind of integrity that leaves a lasting legacy long after the voices of the crowd have faded into silence. Rest well, dear friends, and may your dreams be filled with the peace that comes from knowing you serve a God who honours faithfulness, rewards courage, and never abandons those who trust in him. The story of Micaiah reminds us that in God's kingdom, standing alone with truth is always better than standing with the crowd in deception. Sleep peacefully, knowing that like Micaiah, you're never truly alone when you walk in the light of divine truth.